Welcome to BellingHistory with the Good Time Girls, a hyper-local podcast about the quirky history of Bellingham, Washington, and the fourth corner of the United States.
Even though we like to keep things close to home, these stories are no less entertaining to the masses and those who find themselves, unfortunately, outside of the P&W. We are your hosts. I'm Ren.
And I'm Colby, and we are co-owners of BellingHistory Tours, also known as the Good Time Girls. If you want to know more about our tour business, visit our website at BellingHistory.com.
Today's episode is called Queerstory of Bellingham.
Cheers.
Cheers to
queers.
Cheers to queers. Oh, that might be a title.
That's our title.
Since June is Pride Month here in the USA and we have an extra week, we decided to record a queer-themed episode for this month. So we're going to do a sort of overview of BellingQueerstory or Bellingham Queerstory, at least as we know it.
Yeah, so Bellingham's Pride celebration is held in July and has been for a number of years because, well, the chance of weather is better. And also then it doesn't interfere with other regional Pride celebrations. So if people want to go to Seattle and Anacortes and wherever else, there's...
That's right, you're welcome.
So we just launched a queer history tour this month leading up to Bellingham Pride celebration, and that's something that's been in the works for a while. So I started at a prototype one during Pride 1 year, pre-pandemic, and then that got shelved for a couple of years. Last year I had COVID during Pride and completely missed everything while quarantining. So, meanwhile, I've been looking at other cities and what they did in terms of tours, and Bellingham it's kind of a unique and interesting place. It has a fairly robust queer history for a town of its size, which might have to do with positioning being between Seattle and Vancouver, as well as being a college town, presence of Western Washington University here. So, but these stories, even though a lot of it is fairly recent history, more recent than a lot of our tour material, which by a good century, it feels important to tell. And also it does share similarities with our mission of portraying all stories.
But we feel like it's important to think about whose stories get told and why some stories have been left out. And right now we are living in another era of cultural backlash, and there is a pushback against inclusive curriculum in schools, etc. And we think queer history is important. Knowing the ideas about gender and sexuality have changed over time helps kind of put things in perspective of what is going on today. We have a very short attention span in this country. We hope having representation in history in this place increases people's sense of belonging. Which is tricky because sometimes the stories are not stories of being welcome in this place, but in the sense of knowing these stories of those that came before and lived through times of varying cultural acceptance. We hope this can help provide the basis for appreciation of human diversity. You know, this ain't going away.
Not going anywhere. Keep having queer babies.
Weird. And yeah, you just can't legislate or pray it away, even though we're sure gonna fucking try in this country, aren't we?
Oh, yeah, that's what it seems like. So I want to talk for a minute about the evolution of concepts and language and terminology. Though people in the past live lives that we recognize in terms of our modern understandings of what it means to be LGBTQ+, our modern concepts of sexual and gender identity just didn't exist prior to about the mid-20th century and beyond. So historical terminology really lacked our specificity. We've got categories for everything nowadays.
Yeah, language is so interesting and so important. It can be hard to know who you are unless you can name it. Many people just didn't know where they fit in until some of these newer terms started to be used and resonate with people. That said, we have to be careful to realize that while we know those gender identities and sexual orientations didn't just appear in modern times, it can still be problematic to label persons in the past using our modern terms because we just don't know and can't know what they would have identified, even if those terms had existed then. Even when certain terms existed, often coincides with periods of intense social stigma and actual laws. So many people by necessity guarded their identities so tightly that we're still not exactly sure years after their death. But we can recognize familiar behaviors right, that fall outside of cultural norms around gender and sexual binaries. Pronouns and terms are important to us today, but it can be challenging to figure out how to refer to persons who were gender nonconforming in the past.
Yeah, my general take is to use pronouns correlating with whatever gender they presented as publicly, or when in doubt, or if that doesn't feel quite right, I just go with they, them.
Mm-hmm.
Which is such a handy thing
Always
we have
good
nowadays.
to do. Yeah.
So a local example, though, of some difficulty when you're looking at historical stories and resources is some articles about a person named Wa Moi. The first article is from 1907, in which Wa Moi is described as a dainty maiden. And I think this one's worth just reading. Do you want to read it, Ren?
Yeah. Well, we have November 7th, 1907. Girl discards skirts for trousers. Pretty Wa Moi works all summer with a gang of Chinese cannery men. Sex of dainty and dapper, I'm not going to say it, is not suspected. Okay, so it says, to have worked all summer in a cannery with the Chinese and Japanese men, and to have lived at the same bunkhouse, though in a separate and private apartment, mingling freely among the men and being treated as one of the gang, has been the experience of Wa Moi, the daintiest and yet most dapper little Chinese maiden Bellingham has ever entertained. Miss Wa Moi was a passenger on board the George E. Star this morning en route to Beach Lummy Island. Not one of the other passengers, it is safe to say, realized that the swell-dressed little Chinese was a woman. Little Miss Wa Moi carried herself with a charming swagger, and yet has the appearance of taking life very seriously. Her pretty black eyes took in everything and never once showed an inclination to flirt. Dressed in a gray checked suit of clothes, with trousers turned up in the most approved manner, gray hat, kid gloves, and the shiniest of patent leather men's pumps, Miss Wa Moi rode over on the streetcar, swinging on and off the car in a manner that would have fooled any man. As a friend of the purser, however, she consented to talk to the reporter, freely admitting her sex, though not without several pretty blushes. I wear these clothes because I like them better than skirts, said Miss Wa Moi in the best English. I work at the Carlisle Packing Company cannery at Beach, and as I am the only girl there, it would attract too much attention if I wore girls' clothes. Besides, I couldn't be bothered with skirts. I've been attending night school, studying part-time in Seattle, and part of the time in this city. Now I'm going back to work in the cannery. The men don't seem to mind my being there, and I find that I can do the work about as well as they do. Am I afraid of being arrested? No. Where I work, they think it is my own business how I dress, and few others know that I am a girl.
A lot going on there. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I love that the attention to detail. But so I'm like, okay, this is interesting. And then I start searching for more about Wa Moi, and I'm just going to say that with Asian names in particular, it's very difficult because the census takers and record takers just butcher them horribly. I know some tricks, and it was still very difficult. Yeah, but I did find one other article in the Herald. It's from 1909, and in this one, they're described quite differently. Yeah. So
Wa Moi returns in resplendent new togs. Wa Moi, the son of a wealthy Chinese merchant, who was thought to be an oriental maiden traveling in disguise when he arrived in the city last spring to study the salmon packing industry, is again in Bellingham. Wa is sporting the loudest clothes that money can buy and is exciting the envy of the Chinese and Japanese population of South Bellingham. The clothes that Wa wears are up to date, too. His hat, which he states was imported from Paris, is decorated with a wide green silk hatband, and a brown ribbon adorns the lid. His suit is of the brightest blue, and tan shoes and green hose are displayed with the greatest gusto. Although Wa states that he does not pretend to keep up with the styles, his necktie of bright red and orange shirt makes him very conspicuous on the street. Wa also wears tan kid gloves and is groomed as careful as any quarter horse.
So I don't know what to think. I mean, these are the only two mentions I can find. And,
Yeah, we can't quite
like,
tell.
Which I'm like, maybe Wamoy is just fucking with them.
It really could go either way.
I don't know. And I kind of love that. I kind of love that it's just this weird mystery.
It's ambiguous, and I love that they are written about because they dress so freaking cool.
Right. The obsession with the detail of the outfits is
and
like,
both of them, right? Like that was why anyone took notice. Hell yeah, Wamoy.
So we're just gonna dive in and kind of do a through the years full on exploration of queer history.
All right, well then we got to start way back. Our town here is built on the indigenous land of the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe. Traditional customs of indigenous folks were suppressed very early on by some of the first white European Americans to arrive in the area, some of the earliest of whom were missionaries who worked very hard to Christianize the indigenous populations and discouraged their cultural practices in favor of Eurocentric Christian ones. I think it's pretty common. I've heard the term two-spirit, and maybe you have too. And that concept, or something like it, was found in many different indigenous groups in the U.S. And trying to look that up, what might have been practiced among Coast Salish groups, it's difficult to find anything. The Christianization and sending of children to schools, just so much was lost in a few generations. And we can say we know there were traditional cultural practices around sexuality and partnering that seemed very scandalous to those early missionaries, promiscuous or permissive. And of course, those were actively discouraged and whitewashed out.
Yeah. So this is an aside here, but I just recently was looking up something about the Catholic cemetery and started reading a biography of Father Boulay, who was an early Catholic priest here in town. And so he was French-Canadian, and he was orphaned as a child and was raised by apparently very strict religious grandparents in Canada. And then here's a little quote. "This child grew up a sad, thoughtful, bashful, and extremely delicate boy, a lover of books, and a stranger to the realm of boyhood."
Whoa.
And then it says, "The books of his childhood were of a religious nature, written in French, dealing in stories of angels. As a child, he spent his days praying to die, that he might go to the beautiful world where these bright angels dwelt. When about 15 years old, he became reconciled to life and quit praying to die." Oh. And then in the year 1863, it says he went back to Canada, attended seminary, and there he met a young man who was a priest, and the two became the best of chums.
Okay, yeah.
And in August of 1864, the two left Montreal for Vancouver, Washington, having agreed to spend their lives together in Indian missions. So I'm just reading this, and I'm going like, holy crap, like,
wow.
You know? There's just some things in there that ring some bells, and you're like, there's so many layers to this where I was just like, oh my God. And then these two dudes go off together to the West where they can kind of be, you know, out on their own, doing their own thing.
Do their own thing.
But at the same time, they're out there missionizing, you know? It's...
We want to root for them, and we also don't want to root for them.
I know. I just found myself being like, wow, like what a weird world.
Yeah.
That's just a random thing I came across recently and was like,
what? That's a yeah, so fucked up missionaries aside, in this frontier era culture in the 1800s, what is interesting is that this was actually a period in which homophobia, like we think of it, was not such a part of the culture. In terms of what was acceptable masculine or feminine behavior or intimate relationships, etc., wasn't so set in stone. Expressions of love and longing that today we would label lesbian were commonplace. All those letters of women pouring out their hearts to each other with phrases like, 1,000 kisses, or I love you with my whole soul. We know from photographs and diaries, for instance, that men during the California Gold Rush had very intimate relationships to our modern sensibilities, including recorded history of men being lovers. But a lot of what also may be just very warm same-sex friendship, and it was just an okay thing. Happily having intimate lives with other men in ways that would be scrutinized today or seen as gay was somewhat commonplace. So, in the frontier era, there was what sometimes seemed like a surprising amount of tolerance. People were just trying to survive. Cross-dressing was common in the Old West, especially for AFAB presenting as male. If you could present as a man, you could reap some of those benefits. Often they were out and woven into the fabric of society. For example, like Calamity Jane, or maybe the character in our last story. However, some people were not so tolerant, and these folks would put a lot of pressure on officials to make rules and laws around things they saw as morally questionable. Frontier towns started to enact laws to crack down on quote-unquote immorality and Wild West anything-goes behavior, and the primary targets were prostitution, gambling, and the like, but also cross-dressing. San Francisco enacted a city statute forbidding cross-dressing in the 1860s, pretty early on.
Of course, gender during this period was very gender segregated with very gender specific fashion, except for children, which I love. You can never tell.
Oh, I know, for sure. For sure, the little dress. Right. I love it.
But again, the term cross-dressing lumped a lot of things together that would be more distinct today. And there's always been a variety of reasons to wear clothing considered culturally designated for specific genders, like performance and drag and things like that, or as a way to be in a relationship with someone of the same gender. You know, that wasn't socially acceptable, then pretend to be one or the other and you might get away with it. Or for reasons of social mobility. But when you see it becoming like consistent and something done when it's not just beneficial, it starts to feel like something we might call transgender today. But again, it's hard to say. And we don't have much local history from this early frontier era in terms of anything that can be recognized even as possibly queer, just because not a lot of records. So until you get a fairly large population of non-Indigenous people here in the late 1800s, when the railroads come and there are multiple newspapers and people getting arrested and a lot more sources of information that might have been preserved. Probably one of the earliest little tidbits I found is that the vaudeville theater called the Casino employed a female impersonator as part of their stock company, which that was a little vaudeville casino in the 1890s, shut down by 1905. And the female impersonator was Joseph Noel, and we almost know nothing else about him, just very few records.
So we had the 4 smaller towns around the bay. In 1903, when the towns on the bay officially did consolidate to become Bellingham, the new town had to create a new municipal code. And this included an ordinance prohibiting cross-dressing under, quote, offenses against public morals and decency, indecent exposure, etc. Quote, whoever shall appear in any public place or in any place exposed to the public view within said city in a state of nudity or in a dress not belonging to his or her sex or in an indecent or lewd dress or shall make any indecent exposure of his or her person or be guilty of any lewd or indecent act of behavior shall on conviction be fined not less than $5 or more than $50 and costs. The equivalent of $5, $160 today, or $50, $1,600 today. In 1905, the newspaper provides us with an example saying, boy parades in girls' clothing, pays for his fun by a term in jail. Here we go. Ray Shriver and Ed Bertrand were fined $25 and costs each in the police court this morning, and in default of payment were committed to jail for 17 days. The 2 boys were arrested in the lodging house over the office saloon last night and were charged with disturbing the peace. Shriver was dressed in girls' clothing at the time he was arrested and had been parading in the streets in that fashion. He had a complete outfit, and the impersonation was perfect. Patrolman Scheisler was going down the Northern Pacific Alley at a late hour when he heard a shot fired on Holly Street. He turned and ran back in the direction of the shot, what he suspected to be a man and a woman running the alley from Holly Street and up the back stairs to the lodging house over the office bar. He gave chase and caught the couple just after they had entered a room in the house. The 2 boys denied any connection with the shooting, and when they were searched at the time of the arrest, no gun was found.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because, I mean, I guess gunshots could just be randomly going off in downtown Bellingham at the time. It was kind of that kind of a place, but also, you know. It's a little sus that, like, he's like, I heard a gunshot and then I chased him, but they didn't have a gun. It's interesting because at the same time, you could get arrested on the streets for cross-dressing. You would be totally fine and indeed celebrated for being on stage. At the same time as when you have the whole vaudeville tradition, and a lot of stuff I've collected comes out of my obsession with vaudeville and vaudevillians. And I was actually pretty surprised at the number of impersonators on the vaudeville circuit in the early 1900s. And of course, these stories got preserved in the newspaper, the write-ups about the shows and things like that, which just is also a reminder that what we have in terms of history can be kind of skewed towards the type of records that get preserved, right? So arrests and newspaper reviews, you know, are what we have. Things like diaries and letters are like the dream to find, but are often purposely destroyed, especially by family members. This still happens, you know, resulting in a lot of purposeful erasure of people's stories. So just to keep in mind that, like, the type of records does kind of skew the kinds of stories that we hear and know and can tell. Yeah. But the drag tradition, of course, is as old as theater itself. And, of course, theater has always been a haven for gender and sexually non-conforming folks. Theater kids, shout out.
Hey!
But we mentioned Joseph Noel, but also in the early 1900s, there were lots of vaudeville houses. This was before movies, motion pictures, before radio. Vaudeville was the fun time in town for the whole family. Also see our blog for more on such performers as Vardaman, the gay deceiver, the Huntress, Percy Yarrick, the Great Richards, and the most famous Julian Eltinge, who performed in Bellingham in 1913 at the American Theater. There were also male impersonators, including one from Bellingham, and I'm not going to go into detail on that because I'm going to be writing, and yes, we will do a deeper dive on all this later because, of course. But aside from stage performers and arrest records, you know, you just come across little clues and things that spark glimmers of recognition and set off the old gaydar. So a lot of the time, you know, we don't know for sure. And I absolutely am guilty of shipping, as the children say, historical figures and projecting, you know, my own fantasies about their lives. Sometimes, you know, I'm like, I'm aware. I'm just writing historical fan fiction in my head. Which, anyway, just wanted to get that out there.
There you go. Another thing that was going on here in Bellingham in the early 1900s was there were a lot of so-called new women, meaning, this quote, a generation of women who came of age between 1890 and 1920 and challenged gender norms and structures by asserting a new public presence through work, education, entertainment, and politics, while also denoting a distinctly modern appearance that contrasted with Victorian ideals. One of the reasons we had this going on here was because we had the normal school. You want to talk about educating women?
Yeah, just the normal school sprang up in around 1900 and was a place to educate women to become teachers. Mostly women. It was for anybody, but the vast majority of people learning to become a teacher at the time were women. But there were also all the rules that if you were a teacher during this time, you could not be married. Yeah. Things like that. So yeah, you also had the fact that women who became educated often chose not to get married. Surprise, surprise.
Here's a good career where you can't be married. I'm in. I never put that together before, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yes.
You had women, some of whom owned property together, traveled together, and had very close relationships that might be called a Boston marriage. A Boston marriage was, historically, the cohabitation of two women independent of financial support from a man. It's the old roommates joke. Like, my sister lives with her best friend. They've been living together for 30-something years. They're just really good friends and roommates.
They were roommates. Wink, wink.
So that term Boston marriage actually came from Henry James's The Bostonians, an 1886 novel involving a long-term cohabitating relationship between two unmarried women, although James himself never used the term. At the turn of the 19th century, the term described relationships between women who had their lives with each other in a very public way and opted out of heterosexual marriage altogether. So we're mostly talking about white, middle, and upper class women. Class and white privilege played a role in the ability to live like this and to be accepted and, successful. Obviously, you have to have money. The papers wrote stories and wrung their hands. Reportedly, half of women who graduated from college at the turn of the 20th century chose not to marry, compared to about 10% of women overall during this time period. This was a disturbing trend to many observers, and there was a lot of social unease around women's rejection of marriage. Sounds familiar. Turns out educating women can cause problems for the patriarchy.
Yes. So I'm not including any names here of people that I've had my suspicions about these types of relationships. But anyone,
as a historian,
history nerds,
there's some clues.
Chime in. Well, who you think, maybe. Yeah, there was this period of the 1910s and 20s where there was a lot of change going on, and you had, this whole moral purity movement, like in the 1910s, there was the shutting down of the red light district and the, town going dry, things like that. So there's definitely, then the 1920s come and they've criminalized all these behaviors in the name of morality. And so a lot of people are just like, well, to hell with it, and just start having a good time anyway.
Just a backlash.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's how you get the Roaring 20s. But then, of course, the 30s come along and the Depression, and if the 30s was kind of a mixed bag, you start to see that pendulum swing back into this moral panicky stuff, and you start to see criminalization and new laws being created and old laws being strictly enforced. So a lot of those things like the cross-dressing laws and those morality laws are, subjectively worded. Like, who's to say what it doesn't spell out what exactly lewd behavior is or whatever. And a lot of the times,
to interpretation.
Yeah, so that happens a lot and increasingly so.
But yeah, then we get 40s and 50s.
So
and
yes.
Like, nope, everybody's going down.
Yeah, so by the time you get into the 40s, you start to see the reports and arrests for sodomy. So sodomy laws generally prohibit oral and anal sex, even between consenting adults, and that theoretically should apply to everyone, but of course, primarily used against gay men. Washington did not repeal laws that criminalized consensual sodomy until July 1976, effectively. But in the 1940s and 50s, police used surveillance and entrapment. They would just basically have, young plainclothes people untrap men by leading them on. And then sometimes I think it wasn't even police officers. They would just get people, pay them to do that, and then report back. And obviously they were keeping tabs. Sometimes they would probably be watching these people for over long periods of time and trying to get as many names as they possibly could. So in a 1941 article discussing a, quote, roundup, the Herald remarked, "The alleged unlawful activities of some of those under arrest extend back for a period of 2 years or more. Others are relative newcomers in the alleged clique." So they're just showing that they had been surveilling these people for quite some time before starting to round them up and arrest them.
Putting a lot of effort into...
Yeah, but their names were printed in the paper, so they were forcibly outed. But I did do a bunch of research on them, and a lot of them, were married with families and living, deeply closeted lives. And it's hard to imagine how that life would then be completely destroyed. You could lose your job, not to mention ostracization from family and community. Whereas, at least today, jobs are protected. Right. Whereas, ostracization is still with us, unfortunately. So, and that brings us into the whole, McCarthy Red Scare, Lavender Scare.
Oh man, yeah, it just keeps on going. Yeah, along with the Cold War, the witch hunts against the commies, the federal government and the daily press led a crusade of moral panic against homosexuals. The FBI began actively searching for people labeled quote-unquote moral perverts or degenerates or sex deviates. Thousands upon thousands of Americans lost their jobs and had their careers destroyed. And the publicity this crusade received encouraged local police forces as well as haters in general to pursue LGBT people in bars and on the streets of American cities. It was very much this kind of environment if you were gay or gender nonconforming person living in Bellingham or Whatcom County in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even beyond.
Yeah, and again, because it was such a repressive period, there's just, aside from arrest records, there's not hardly any information because families would have been ashamed and not wanted to have any knowledge that anyone in their family might have been gay. But we do have some stories from oral histories and things like that, especially from the sort of tail end of the period. But we know there were things like rumored pickup spots. There are stories about the bathrooms at the Greyhound station that were described as a, quote, hot spot for gay pickup. One interviewee said they encountered very important political people there. So at
Shocking.
the time, the Greyhound station was located in the building on the corner of State Street and Magnolia in the Puget Sound Power and Light building, currently home to Jack's Barbecue. But also a lot of people just traveled out of town to go find community in cities because it was safer to be more anonymous and in a larger pool of fish, of course. So, interestingly, also Canada, because of the no booze on Sunday laws, which apparently didn't get changed until, I think, Expo 86.
Oh, yeah, when they could make some good money on it. Yeah. 86, gosh.
Yeah,
darn.
right? I know. So, apparently, especially in the 70s and 80s, Canadians came down to Bellingham. So that really kind of gave a boost to the Bellingham gay scene.
The milk and the cheese. It was the gay bars and the booze.
I think just bars in general.
Bars
but that
in general,
trickles over to the...
we got some of that culture. We got some of that, queer culture probably coming down from the big city. I like that.
And then Bellingham really comes into its openly gay era after Stonewall in the 70s.
Hallelujah. A little bit about Stonewall. And that is the reason we have Pride Parades today. So let's jump in. Stonewall riots in New York City in June of 1969. Stonewall was not the first time queer communities took a stand in protest of unfair treatment, but Stonewall has become a pivotal event in the LGBTQ civil rights movement. There are loads of podcasts and articles about Stonewall out there, so we're not going to go too far into it. But we do recommend obviously doing a deeper dive if you think you know the history. It is way more complicated than it is often presented in popular media. So Stonewall gets a lot of media attention, as we said, both now and at the time. As we said, in June of 1969, and then the following year there was a march to commemorate that event. And then you started to get events springing up in solidarity all around the country. All of this is influenced by and tied in with the civil rights movement.
Yeah, and not surprisingly, here in Bellingham, the college campus was the early scene of activism and organization. So in the early 1970s, you get the Gay People's Alliance formed up at the Western Washington State College, which is now Western Washington University today, but it was called WWSC at the time. In October of 1971, the Western Front reported, "Gays hold first meeting. Topics such as the legal and psychological problems affecting the gay community and possible future action to acquaint the public with the homophile movement highlighted the first meeting of the Gay People's Alliance Wednesday night in the Viking Union. More than 30 people attended. All but 3 were students at Western." So I want to point out at the time that young adults attending school away from their hometowns perhaps find more freedom and safety. That environment was not necessarily shared by people who were living or grew up in the bigger community and would have more at stake. So I think for that reason, among others, is why the college becomes the center of or most of those activities around gay rights and what would come to be known as Pride throughout the following decades of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So the Gay People's Alliance began to hold symposiums that were some of the earliest gay pride events in Washington state even.
Cool.
Yeah, we were like quite a radical
Yes,
little
they
place
were.
here in the
Yeah.
70s. San Francisco North, sometimes called.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of that has to do with the university,
Yeah.
liberal bastion of progressive thinking.
Thank heavens. Mhm.
So in 1972, the symposium was specifically called Gay Pride Week and featured mostly speakers on various topics. William Dubé of the nonprofit organization called Stonewall. This was out of Seattle. He was a former Catholic priest. And the Reverend Troy Perry, the founder of the Metropolitan Community Church, which is for gay people. You also had medical professionals, legal professionals. You had a panel discussion on gay theater, Natch, and a dance and art show and a drag show in the View Lounge.
Hell yeah.
Featuring, quote, the Pacific Northwest's foremost female impersonators of Bobby, John John, and Misty Dawn.
Love all of those.
And there's pictures of them in the Western Front.
Yes.
It's pretty fabulous. And I was really trying to find more information about Bobby, John John, and Misty Dawn. Haven't found any, so if anyone knows any, shout out.
Please.
Early organizers of the Gay People's Alliance and these events were two women I want to mention, Rebecca and Valerie Valerigine. So they were at the time living as a married couple and took the same last name. And Rebecca, or Beck Valerigine, became quite well known for her one-woman play called The Lavender Troubadour, which is on YouTube in its entirety. We can link to that.
Wow.
It's pretty fun.
Hell yeah.
It's actually very sad, but
Yeah, well.
but it's interesting to watch.
That's very cool.
And she was a singer, recorded albums, did a lot of stuff, and so I just wanted to give that kind of a shout out.
Outside of just the university in the 1970s, you had the beginning of a local barony of the imperial court system. The imperial court system was founded in San Francisco, California in 1965 by Jose Sarria, affectionately known as Mama Jose. It turned into a fundraising group with volunteer members bearing titles of nobility. So yearly elected figurehead leaders of emperor and empress, of course. Traditionally, empresses were quote-unquote girls, aka drag queens, and emperors were leather daddies. Love this.
I think it's changed a little bit over the years. It's gotten more gender inclusive and, you know.
Sure. Empires formed in other cities. Portland and Seattle were two of the earliest. Some contention over the exact order of things. But Bellingham, by the mid-1970s, was part of a regional barony, the domain of Skagit and Whatcom. Yay! In the 1970s, we also get Bellingham's first listing in the Damron's Guide, called the Gay Green Book. Green Book was an annual guidebook for African American travelers, originated and published by New York City postal worker Victor Hugo Green from 1936 to 1966, during the era of the Jim Crow laws, showing where you could eat, find lodgings, enjoy yourself without concerns of experiencing racism. And Damrod's was the gay version of that. It was secretly published in 1965 by Bob Damron, listing gay bars and businesses in every major U.S. city. So, Damron was a San Francisco bar owner and a member of the Mattachine Society, an early national gay rights organization in the United States. That was a secret organization started in Los Angeles in 1950. Damron collaborated with members to publish the, quote, address book. At first, it was just a small wallet-sized book. It was very plain, no mention of the word gay or homosexual, yet full of clues and insider lingo. The books used a system of codes such as RT for rugged types or rough trade. Take your pick. Love it. As the gay rights movement gained momentum, the books quickly transformed and contained overt advertisements, and listings grew dramatically. There were also other small regional networks, newsletters, and guides, and Damron's Guide is still being published today, but there's obviously a lot of competition.
Good old internet. Yeah, it's great, though. There are a lot of places that have archived Damron's Guides, and so there are scanned copies available and, like, searchable online, which is where I found Bellingham first listed in 1972. So the first listing of Bellingham in Damron's guide was the Iron Bull, which was on Bay Street where the Pickford Cinema is today, in that very building. It was coded M for mixed, which meant it would be a mixed bar, so straight people would also be there. Mm-hmm. So it would be a few more years before Bellingham had what could be considered a designated gay bar. The Iron Bull was a restaurant, tavern / disco kind of a establishment. It was very 70s. They had started in the Alaska building, which was up on State and Holly, and then that burned down, I think, in 69. And there was one in Seattle as well. I think it was the original Iron Bull. But they had this very 70s logo. This like bold black font on an orange-red background. Mm-hmm. So I have a copy of the menu here. Mm-hmm. And their specialty were really disgusting sounding wine drinks with a bullfighting theme. And some of these have descriptions that wouldn't fly today, like the Iron Bull Special. If last night wasn't the night, ply her with this.
Whoa! Boo!
Right? It's pretty gross.
Ooh, a lot of... sounds disgusting,
right?
Too.
Wine flips on the side. So a flip is a drink made with egg, typically served warm. And the types of wine that are listed, they're all like very sweet, just like
some port. Ew, port with egg in
how
it.
many people threw up in the Iron Bowl is what I want to know.
Yeah,
anyway, in 1975, the Damron's Guide included the Iron Bowl, but also the Up and Up Tavern, which we're going to talk more about shortly. Also mentioned in the 70s Damron Guides, Cornwall Park for cruising, Whatcom Falls Park, Great Northern Books, and the Hut Tavern. So before we get into the bars, I want to give a shout out to Great Northern Books, which opened in the 70s as an adult store, also aka the adult shop. So 70s golden age of porn.
Right. 70s porn. They're
yeah.
Joking around.
Yeah, and this place has a very interesting history, which I'm not going to get into right now. But let's just say it was a staple of the community, especially when it became owned by a queer man. It became a safe place, a place to meet people, and, you know, it had the little booths in the back. It was a whole thing. It was a hookup spot. Recently, it's been converted to an antique store. You know, the internet kind of killed. You've got Grindr now. You've got, you know, buy all your toys online.
At your fingertips, literally.
But if you need a leather cleaner, they got you.
Okay. Okay, well, so some other bars.
Yes, let's talk about bars.
Aside from the Iron Bowl, you also had the Up and Up Tavern, often cited as the first gay congregating bar. Though, again, it was also mixed. And it was known for cold, cheap beer and became kind of a hit with the youth and the counterculture, so it was an accepting kind of place. So many of you who have been around a few years may remember the Up and Up in its long-standing location on State Street, where Carnal is now. It was there beginning in 1974 until... around 2019?
Pandemic closed.
Yeah. Before that, it had been on Holly Street near Commercial, where the bank is, across from the parking garage. So one of the bartenders at the old Up and Up was a gay Bellingham man named Steve, who gave a great oral history interview. And we love this explanation of how the Up and Up became known as the world-famous Up and Up Tavern. So at some point, English sailors had visited the bar and had a rousing time, and then later... quote, I had a guy come into the bar a few months later and says, "Are you Steve?" He had an Australian accent, and he said, "Well, I was told that this was the place to come by my mates back home. And that's where I decided that we were world famous because these sailors from all over the world were talking about this little bar in Bellingham. So I started answering the phone, world famous Up and Up."
I love that.
I love it so much. When they moved to State Street location, they added the world famous to the sign.
And that is a great example of word of mouth and how people use that to find gay-friendly establishments all over the world.
Yes, the military.
Yeah, and Bellingham has always been a port of call, so to speak, and a place where military guys came on leave. 1974 is when you get the birth of the really first designated gay bar in Bellingham, whose lineage continues on, still with us today, as Rumors Cabaret and the Back Door. But we can trace that back to the Alaska Tavern, which in the 70s, it was at 209 West Holly. There's like a little nail place in there now. Mm-hmm. But according to some sources at the time, it was known for a place where the lesbians like to congregate. And there was a straight woman who was bartending there who heard them talking about how they wished they had their own bar. And this woman was named Joy Tollum, and Joy bought a tavern up on State Street that was called The Hut, and they began to specifically advertise it as a gay bar, and she hired lesbian bartenders. And in November of 1974, the Western Front announced Gay Tavern to open soon. And here's a quote from the article. Just a year and a half ago, Joy Tollum had never been in a tavern or talked to a homosexual. Next month, Tollum, who has been a secretary for the last 18 years, will own Bellingham's only gay bar. And here's a quote from Joy. In the past, I've always done as I've wanted and not been too bothered about what people think. I've always advocated that people should do their own thing.
All right, Joy.
I know. And it says, after taking a night bartending job at the Alaska Tavern in 1972, Tollum, who is straight, became acquainted with some of the gays that periodically patronized the bar. I didn't know gays had so many problems. One is just finding a place to go, which has the right atmosphere, Tollum said. In the past, gays had tried to finance a gay bar in Bellingham, but couldn't come up with the funds. After hearing the pros and cons of the venture, Tollum agreed to invest some of her savings in the project. With a friend as partner, Tollum purchased the Hut Tavern in downtown Bellingham. Utilizing the suggestions and labor of gays who will patronize the tavern, Tollum will remodel the bar for reopening at the end of December, with a focus on creating a warm atmosphere for the gays. She said, by taking down the beer signs and hanging up plants and drapes, I can create a cozy kind of atmosphere that will appeal to many people.
God, first hipster bar.
I know!
Okay, a lot of people. Hallelujah.
I know. And she said many of her friends had been critical because she was going to open a bar for the gays, but she said, I won't feel uncomfortable even if I'm the only straight in the bar, and anyone should feel free to come in.
Oh, bless her heart.
I know, it's very cute. So the Hut was at 1317 and a half State Street. So today, Diana's delicious Italian restaurant is in the entire building, but originally it was in 3 separate storefronts. So the Hut was right in the middle, and it had been a tavern there since Prohibition had ended in the 1930s. And the exterior and interior were both decorated like an old log cabin with like old growth cedar shingles. And one person described it as very quaint. And there's this adorable ad from the Northwest Passage newspaper from 1975. And it's like hand-drawn with a little drawing of like the frame of like a hut. And there's like flowers and mushrooms growing around the base. And it says the hut in like a twig font, if that's a thing.
Yeah, little leaves.
You know, and at the bottom it says in quotes, the gayest bar in town. And then in the roof there's like the little intertwined female symbols on one side and the little intertwined male symbols. So very much like just advertising.
I want to go
as
to
a gay
there.
bar. It's pretty fun.
Oh, fucking fantastic.
And the only mention in the Herald that I found was from 1976, where it just said, the Hut Tavern is best known for its distinctive clientele. And then, you know, it wasn't all sweet and easy by any means. The oral history interview with Steve Morgan, he describes a time in 1976 where there was an incident where some people had thrown a rock through the window. And Steve chased them down the street. And the best part was, at the time, he was dressed as, quote, Betty Bicentennial.
Yes.
Wearing a red, white, and blue wig and glitter and a skirt. So the Hut operated there through the end of the decade, which brings us to the 1980s.
Already the 1980s. In 1981, the Hut was bought by some guys from San Francisco who wanted to have a very California-style bar. Oh, sounds so familiar, doesn't it, Bellingham?
They lasted a good 4 or 5 years as Toyon.
Is that what they're... Okay.
That was what it was called.
Did they redecorate?
Presumably.
Yeah, you would think so. If it was a California, it wasn't no Hut.
I'm imagining
chimneys.
like the back door. Only Bellingham wasn't ready for it yet, you know.
Okay. But then, so they went back to California, sold to Wayne Miller in 84, 85. And Rumors was born. Woohoo! First, it was described as a tiny place, at least the barbershop next door, and expanded. Wayne Miller opened for over 20 years until his passing in 2017. Wayne grew up on a farm in Skagit County, attended Burlington schools and Western Washington University. At the time he opened Rumors, he was in his 30s. Well, here's a story about the early days of rumors. There was a bartender named Shorty who kept a catcher's mitt handy to safely scoop up the smoke bombs that people like to throw into the bar.
Right.
Oh, man.
Slightly better than rocks, maybe, but it would set off all the smoke alarms.
All the smoke alarms, yeah, cause a ruckus. It was said that you could tell out-of-towners because they used the front door.
Yeah, so there was a whole stigma, like, if you were being seen going into what was the known gay bar, you know,
even
you could still
had
lose
a front door, and we all knew it was a gay bar.
So the locals came in the back, and that, you know, because they could lose their jobs still and things like that. And that is where the name the back door
comes from. We're learning things today, you guys. the back door, an homage to Wayne and those early days when he first owned the old Rumors. Rumors was 12 years in that State Street location before moving to Railroad in the next decade.
Yes. So continuing on in our journey through the 1980s. You had Bellingham's Imperial Court barony became the Imperial Sovereign Court of the Evergreen Empire.
I love it.
Fabulous name. So that was around 1984 or so. So they continued to have bigger and better coronations, drag shows. And one of the main fundraisers of the organization during the 80s was, of course, in support of the AIDS crisis. We cannot talk about 80s and queer history without talking about the AIDS epidemic. And just a quick refresher, it was 1981 that it was first identified what at the time they were calling gay cancer or GRID. And in 1982, the CDC first used the term AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome. It was 1984 that we got our first diagnosis in Whatcom County, and in 1985, the first local deaths. It wasn't until 1986 that President Ronald Reagan actually mentioned AIDS publicly for the first time. Mm-hmm. So that's how the 80s were going. AIDS would peak in the next decade in 1995, and you would start to see treatment and cases start to decline after that. But in those early years, it was not good and like a death sentence. And the local cases were completely cloaked in the media, hardly talked about. First people diagnosed had little to no support. Friends basically started passing around a collection plate in the bar to try to raise money to support. And that is how the Evergreen AIDS Support Services got started in 1987. By 1988, there was about a dozen or more cases and really needing more support. So the group started to form an actual nonprofit organization. Because once diagnosed with full-blown AIDS, you know, the victims are very ill, unable to work, but still, you know, a year or two life expectancy. How do you pay rent if you can't work? A lot of them ostracized from families. So it was a pretty dire situation. And when Evergreen AIDS Support first went looking for an office in Bellingham, they were turned away by 3 building owners who feared that other tenants would leave or wouldn't want to rent there. They finally found a home in the Mount Baker Professional Buildings. That's where the greenhouse is. Wow. That was their first location. It was all volunteers, counselors, doctors, nurses, churches. You know, people stepped in to help all. But yes, AIDS, very sad and very brutal and continues into the 1990s. So let's just continue.
Yeah.
The 1990s.
Yeah. Just horribly, horribly sad. So we get into the 1990s. The AIDS crisis is continuing. In 1992, a young man named Sean Humphrey died of AIDS at St. Joe's Hospital. He was 30 years of age. Sean had talked to his parents about the needs of patients as he lay dying. He said they should be able to live in the last stages of illness graciously and with loving care. Sean died penniless and was only able to spend last days in comfort because he moved in with his parents. In 1993, Sean's parents, Tom and Karen Durham, awarded state money to help build a house for up to 6 patients. The Sean Humphrey House continues to do important work today, though the focus has shifted, thankfully, to helping folks living with HIV rather than dying of AIDS.
Also in the 90s, you had the Song of Messiah Metropolitan Community Church formed a local congregation here in Bellingham. So this was part of that larger Metropolitan Community Church that we mentioned earlier that had formed in California in 1968. So I think for, you know, a lot of people who wanted to practice their faith still, it was a very important thing to have a welcoming church.
Yeah, just to have a life, right?
Really filled a niche, and like these churches sprang up all over the place. Today there's 222 congregations in 37 countries. But today that was on State Street here in Bellingham, and the Reverends Ann Hulse and Sue Stackhouse were the co-pastors. And it wasn't a huge congregation. Bellingham had about a dozen regular members, but they said attendance could get as high as 42.
Oh, right. On the high holidays.
On the high holidays. And it was also a meeting space for a lot of LGBTQ support groups. But let's change gears.
All right. Another very 90s event. The Pacific Northwest Music and Cultural Jamboree.
I just found this, and I found the ads for it in, I think it was the Seattle Gay News, and never heard of this. So I took off from Bellingham and missed Bellingham.
You missed the early
for
90s.
A lot of the 90s.
Yeah.
And then, and then I got pregnant and came back to Bellingham and all of that.
You were totally out of the scene.
Yeah,
for a
so
minute.
I missed this whole thing. Yeah. Otherwise, I feel like this was an event that I totally would have gone to.
For sure. So we had women's music festivals that sprang up in the 70s. Lesbian Woodstocks.
Yes.
Oh,
there's a great documentary. I'm going to forget the name. Put it in the show notes.
Yeah, link it in the show notes. National Women's Music Festival in Illinois, Indiana college campuses. There was the Michigan Women's Music Festival. Became the Lesbian Fest with 10,000 people in 1982. And then smaller festivals sprang up in more than 20 states. Festivals featured workshops, dances, spiritual rituals, drum circles, lots of vegetarian food. So, the proto-Lilith Fair.
Which is falsely
billed in 1997 as the first ever women's festival. Bleh. On that, Lilith Fair did feature corporate-backed, mostly straight female performers to mixed audiences. It did their thing for the 90s. But remember how I said we have a very short attention span in this country?
I know.
10,000 people 10 years earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Criminy. So some of these festivals have continued into the present time, not without controversies over trans attendees. Man, that was a big issue for even me in little old Eugene, Oregon. There were feminist bands who I really loved and refused to acknowledge that trans women were women and should be attending.
It's a
Pretty
whole thing. Still is.
So... this festival ran yearly at Western Washington campus from 1990 to 1995. We had our own little feminist party here. Lineups included many pioneers from the women's festival circuit, such as Chris Williamson, Teresa Troll, and Tret Fury, as well as regionally based artists Motherlode, Venus Envy, and famous Canadian singer Farron performed.
So Farron performed at, I think, a couple different Bellingham Prides, and it was kind of a big deal.
Right on. Yeah, I'm going to make a list.
I just love the names like Motherlode and
Motherlode is the
Venus Envy.
For Rick and Bess.
And they, at least part of their members were from here and performed here a ton. What else happened in the 90s? Rumors moved to Railroad Avenue. And so that's I first went to Rumors when it was on Railroad. Yeah. And I remember going in there, and so I'd had my daughter, and I was living at home with my parents, so I must have left her with the grandparents and had a night out, and I had a freshly shaved head. Nice. And I remember I was in there with a friend, and that they came up and they were like, "You're exactly the kind of people we want for our clientele." Okay. And they were brand newly opened, I guess.
Oh, and, wow.
And I remember just kind of being well, I have a baby, so
yeah.
Well, you don't want me very often.
I'll tell my
I don't get out much.
Oh, buddy.
But it was fun.
Oh, that's really sweet. They're yes. We've attracted the right person.
I think we just looked really cool because I was young and
feminist.
I was a hip kid.
Yeah,
that's my memory of Rumors in the 90s.
Nobody's ever said that to me ever. Hey, cool kid. You're exactly the type of person we want here.
So there's a lot in the 90s. So I love that in the late 90s, we got a little gay district over on Champion Street, nicknamed the Triangle District.
I love that.
Where I'm not going to go into details because I want on a future episode going to interview Betty. And a lot of this centers around Betty's coffee shop, which moved from Ferndale to Bellingham. It's called Matt's Place, and some other little shops that were there, including a lesbian-run bookstore called The Rainbow Bridge, which I'm I wish that was still there. That sounds great.
I love a feminist bookstore.
Right?
We need one in town.
I know.
Again.
Really. So that's all going on. Betty Desire, Bellingham's iconic celebrity drag queen, really comes on the scene in the 90s. That's probably, I remember seeing Betty walking up and down Railroad Avenue, you know, back in those days. But let's wrap up with a quick zoom through the 2000s, shall we? In the distant future, the year 2000. Remember that? Was that?
Noise, yep.
Flight of the Conchords, Flight of the Conchords.
Many sources count the first Bellingham Pride Festival from the year 2001, when an organization called Northwest Proud formed in Bellingham to serve as an umbrella group for the local LGBTQ plus scene. Northwest Proud coordinated events to commemorate the 32nd anniversary of Stonewall, including local drag shows, film screenings, a Pride Bash, as well as organizing carpools down to the Seattle Pride Festival. While this was predated by the events held at the college for several decades that we mentioned, this appears to have been like the first time an event was organized by the community at large, with events held off campus. In 2002, Bellingham's P-Flag, Northwest Proud, and Just Us Youth sponsored the Fourth Corner Gay Pride Festival, held at Fairhaven Park. The festival featured entertainment, food, vendor booths, and a potluck family picnic. The festival moved to Bladell Donovan Park in 2003, where it was held for several years before moving downtown to the Farmers Market. Yes, we're moving into the city center in 2006. And moving into the heart of downtown, obviously, brought even more visibility and community engagement. 2007 saw a greatly expanded Pride celebration, including Bellingham's first Pride Parade. In 2011, the city showed support as Bellingham mayors Dan Pike and Kelly Linville both rode in the parade. And in 2013, Bellingham kicked off Pride with a rainbow flag flown at City Hall, as officials declared commitment to equality for all and celebrated the U.S. Supreme Court's decision to strike down the provision of the Defense of Marriage Act that denied federal benefits to legally married same-sex spouses. Oh, it was the happy time, the 2000s. I mean, let's not get too excited. The 2000s were an evil time.
Yeah.
But also, we made some dang dolt strides forward.
It felt like progress was happening.
It did feel like that.
Recently.
And as we know, history is not linear. We go forward and then we go back. And you know, go farther forward.
So, don't for the life of me remember where, but I read some really interesting discussion about cultural backlashes in history, specifically this kind of moral panicky queer fear stuff. And there was like two major times, and one was around the urbanization, so people moving into cities, which happens, so I think it's like in 1910, 1920s, you start to get more people in the United States living in urban centers than rurally for the first time ever in the history of the country. You know, that fuels a lot of cultural change that then you get this backlash that happens in the 30s, 40s, mid-century.
Right.
And then similarly, the internet is like
it's a similar thing, right?
Where it's like this vast, like weird connection of people that hadn't happened before. So, you know, if you had all these people moving into cities and connecting and intermixing in weird ways. And so it was kind of like a similar thing. Ooh. And now we're seeing a backlash.
Interesting.
And it wasn't really until 2010s that we started to have like the internet in our pockets, right? So
as it is, as we know it.
So I mean, we had the internet in the 90s, but it was a weird place. And then, you know, I remember smartphones at first were like weird bricks that you know,
it was nothing you wanted to spend any time on. It was a pain in the ass.
So it is interesting that like it's kind of this
just
backlash
our way of life
to like
now,
the weird interconnectivity that we're so immersed in now.
Right.
I don't understand like what these people think they're doing, like, you know, sheltering children by not allowing children's books and things like this. I'm like, you know, everyone has a smartphone.
Those are, but everybody, it's at their fingertips. If they want to find that, they will.
Yeah, they're gonna find it.
It's just this very antiquated, very ignorant, and...
But yeah, it's like a slippery slope here to fascism, and it's disturbing to say the least.
I do find a little hope in our forward movement. So let's all just educate one another, keep trying to move forward, support each other, love each other. You know, we're super happy to be able to celebrate it. Yeah. Talk about it, inform people. There's a lot to say about it, and a lot of people who didn't get their voices heard. So it's kind of nice to be able to do a small, tiny, itty bitty part in reminding folks. Well, you guys.
We will continue. We'll offer the Bellingham Queer History tours again in the future. I'm going to take a little break after Pride and regroup a little bit. But yeah, we hope to cover more of these little topics that we just kind of...
We've got so many. We've got a spreadsheet, but these are at the top of our list for sure.
Yeah, that wraps up our episode on Bellingham Queer History. Cheers to queers.
Cheers to queers.
We'd like to thank you all for listening to BellingHistory with the Good Time Girls. Do subscribe or review our podcast on your favorite podcast platforms. Like us on all the social medias. You can support us on Patreon if you feel like it. Check out our other tours and events. Read our show notes, our blog, and all of that is at BellingHistory.com.
We'd also like to thank, of course, Devin Champlin and the late great Lucas Hicks for the use of the Gallus Brothers song, Too Bad West Coast Blues. You can find the Gallus Brothers tunes on Bandcamp, and you can find Devin Champlin at Champlin Guitars in Bellingham.
Tune in next time for more BellingHistory.
BellingHistory! Happy Pride!
Well, hey there, mama, where'd you go? You gotta reap just what you sow. That's too bad, too bad. To that old time, the old man Hicks without bad weather. Put on the side, they were sewn together. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music. Most of the time we just look too blue, that's too bad. To listen to that old time music. I lost my hat, I lost my brim, I look like a crow's nest swinging on a limb. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music. Lost my hat, lost my brim, looking like a crow's nest swinging from a limb. That's too bad, too bad. Well, I got no bugging, I got no smokes. I look like Grandpap and all of his folks. That's too bad. To listen to that old time music. Thank you. Thanks.
Oh, God.
That's going to be a fun one to edit.
Oh,